It's go time.
Welcome to Go Time, your source for diverse discussions from all around the Go community. Big thanks to our partners at Fastly for ensuring Go Time reaches you super fast all around the world. Check them out at fastly.com. And to our friends at Fly. Host your app servers and database close to your users. No ops required. Learn more at fly.io. Okay, here we go.
Hello everyone and welcome to Go Time. Today I'm joined by Matthew Boyle, the author of Domain-Driven Design with Golang. How are you doing today, Matt?
Pretty good, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for joining us. We also have another Matt Ryer. How are you, Matt?
Hello, yeah, I'm also good, thanks, John.
So I guess you two couldn't come to a consensus on how to spell your name?
Do you know what, Matt? You're the first Matt I've ever met that uses one T, actually.
Yeah, it is unusual, but it's useful for this because that's how you'll be able to tell us apart. So, John, if you want to say his name, you have to say Matt and really pronounce it.
Very clear.
And you can just drop it like you normally drop all your T's on my name, if you like.
I feel like this would be easier if it was like an R and I could like roll one a little bit longer or something, but...
It's good.
I'm not sure if you had the same experience, Matt, but it was like 10 Matts in high school. And we just kind of unanimously agreed to respond to like Matt 2 or Matt 3 or Matt 1. And it worked pretty well.
That's quite good that you're that organized.
I feel like what normally happens is you just use last names, but I guess you guys didn't like that plan.
Yeah, that would have worked. Sometimes the simple solutions are the best ones.
Was it zero bound index?
No, I don't think we were quite there yet. Which language was it that used one as an index? Maybe we were learning that in school at the time.
Actually, the fumped thing does, and this always throws me off. If you use the verbs inside the fumped package, if you want to actually reference them, because you can do that. A lot of people don't know that, actually. If you pass arguments in, like 1, 2, and like 3 arguments, in the actual verbiage, you can put special brackets and then put the index, but it's not zero bound. So it is literally 1 is the first one, which throws me off every time.
I did not know that.
I mean, I guess the SQL package does that too.
Does it?
But everybody's used to that.
Yeah, that's true, actually. Yeah, if you use $1, $1, $2, $3, yeah, it does. Yeah, it starts at 1. Yeah, you're right. There you go. We were ahead of our time, Matt.
Yeah.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about domain-driven design. So Matt, having written a book on this, seemed like a good guest to teach us everything we need to know.
I haven't written a book about...
Matt, I wouldn't get you on here about something you wrote a book about anyway.
John, you've got to do better with your T's. Otherwise, we're not gonna get through this.
It's going to be tricky. All right. So I guess we could just start off, Matt Boyle, at a high level. Let's just start by talking about what is domain-driven design and sort of like why would people care about it?
For sure. So I think if we kind of break down the phrase, like domain is usually the word that throws people off. But the way I think about domain is the problem space. And so if you think of it as problem space driven design, as in we're going to design our system around our problem space, I think the whole thing makes a little bit more sense as a concept. And I think that's why you should care about it. The closer your system is to the domain, in my opinion, the easier it is to reason about, and it makes it easier to make changes about too. So I guess that's kind of the starting point I would go for is if you are working in a complex problem space and you're trying to think about how to model your system, like it makes sense to try and model it around the problem space because ultimately that's why we write software, right? It's to solve problems for specific problem spaces.
The way that you say that makes it sound so obvious. What's the alternative? What are people doing where this needs to be a podcast?
That's a good question.
I mean, there's definitely other cases where I've seen, like MVC is another way that people structure stuff where they're not really structuring it around their problem space. They're just taking some cookie cutter, way of throwing their code around and they're using it. And I think for some people, especially if you're brand new to coding or something, that type of like, okay, just put this type of code here, this type of code here is a lot easier to get started with. Especially like in the sense, like if you don't know your problem space very well. I think that's the other problem that some people run into is that they haven't sat down to actually think about that. But to go back to your thing about it being problem-spaced, I like that because I've had several people reach out to me and basically say, I can't use domain-driven design because I don't know Go well enough. And like they're thinking the domain's referring to Go. And I'm like, that's not exactly what this means. So I don't think your Go knowledge is actually going to be the limiting factor there.
I thought it was going to be like, get your domain name first for your project. Commit to it for at least a year. You've got a year to build it. That's your clock. And then if you don't do it, you get the reminders every year that you've failed.
That's how startups work, right? You got to get the domain first.
Yeah, what are you going to do? You can't call your startup something and then you find out you can't even get the domain. Domain driven.
I love that, and that is basically how all my side projects work. I'm the proud owner of probably like 30 or 40 domains that are just kind of sat there, and I'm unwilling to give up because I know someday I'm going to build that idea I have, but I haven't quite got there.
Yeah.
I feel like someday when I give a career talk, like if you bring your parents to work or bring your parents to school to talk about your job or whatever, it's going to be like, does owning 30 domains sound good to you? Then this might be the job for you, because every developer owns at least 30.
I like your first idea. Bring your parents to work day.
Bring your parents to work day.
Yeah.
I could try that too.
Yeah. Just get your mum on a podcast.
It'd be interesting.
It would be for me, because I have no insight into your life, and I really want to know what's going on in your head.
People tuning in might not care for it as much, but who knows?
Yeah.
Okay, so when we talk about using domain-driven design, what exactly, like you're saying it's like their problem space. Can you give some examples of what a domain really is, or like what it might shape into with some code, or just concrete examples?
Yeah, I think just to go back to a comment Matt made, firstly is about, like, obviously you're going to build software to model your problem space. Like, what else are you going to do? And I think that's such a fair comment, because it seems obvious, but I think one thing that domain-driven design gives you is it gives you sort of principles, ideas, and a framework to work through to help you figure that out. So I think there's some really key language and sort of ideas that domain-driven design sort of gives us that helps us to think about, like, what is a domain and what is a problem space. And I think a couple of examples that I use in the book is, I think I build like a coffee shop system, right? And you may have a domain around ordering. Like, ordering could be an entire domain in itself, because it's like a vertical slice of a business that has all its own rules, it has its own language, it has its own sort of ideas and thoughts. And so to slice that off into a domain makes a bunch of sense. And then you may have subdomains off of ordering, like maybe order fulfillment is a subdomain of ordering, and it's something that you want to kind of model separately, but use some of the same concepts you have in ordering. So that'd be one example. I think another example I use in the book is like a wallet. Like, you have the sort of domain of a wallet, and within that wallet you might have various different debit, credit, and less relevant these days, but like maybe cryptocurrency would be in your wallet too. And like modeling all those things separately makes sense, but they all kind of belong to this higher order idea of a wallet.
So when it comes to organizing things this way, like, what are the perks that like would cause people to care about actually like separating them into these domains?
Yeah, so I think the first thing, before you even get into code, the biggest benefit I've found in domain-driven design is something that... So there's kind of a couple of things. One is this idea of a bounded context, which is, like, within this circle, like, we're going to have a bunch of language and ideas and rules, and within our circle, they mean very particular things, and we're going to be really specific about what those things mean. That's a really powerful idea, because it means that you can kind of communicate with non-technical colleagues about exactly what you're talking about, and when you say certain phrases, they know exactly what you mean. So one example I always use, I like to use here, is like customers and users. These are the most loaded terms in software engineering, and they mean completely different things depending on who you're talking to, and even the teams within your company. So if you ask someone in marketing what a customer is, they might say it's someone who's had an active subscription for longer than 3 months. If you ask me as a software engineer in a team that builds platform services, you ask me what a customer is, I'm just like, whoever's got a Cloudflare account is a customer as far as I'm concerned. And it's really important that within our separate domains that we have an understanding of what those words and phrases mean, and then we can model them in our system. And then when we go to discuss, like, plan for our next project or plan for whatever we're going to build next, and we've got sort of project managers and perhaps some business folks in the room as well as engineers, every time I say the word customer, even if I'm talking about a piece of code that I've written, everybody knows what I mean. And we're not going to find any of these edge cases or weird things that fell through the gap because I assumed that customer was X when actually to other folks it meant Y.
So this actually has use outside of the project itself. This is about actually speaking the same language as all the other people that you're going to be interacting with.
Exactly, and I think for me that's the most valuable piece of all of this. Is it's if you can get it right, so your system models the business space, the problem, and you can reach sort of a consensus on sort of various language. It means that you can have really great conversations about how things actually work and exactly what needs to happen next with business colleagues without having to do sort of this weird translation in your head between what you've wrote in code and what happens in the system. Like, if you write your code well and it's structured, you can say, when you press that convert button, a lead becomes a customer, and after 6 months we convert that customer to whatever, and then if they leave, they count as churned. All of those words have specific meaning to our team, and if I've used those words in that language in my code, like, it's very, very easy for me to kind of have that conversation and everybody know what I meant.
I would imagine another perk here is that if you're onboarding new team members, like looking at the code helps them come up to date with like all the terminology that your organization uses. Because I suspect most people who join a bigger organization go through that period where they hear acronyms and all these loaded terms being used all the time and have absolutely no idea what any of them mean the first week or two. And I worked at a government contractor for a while, and that was even worse, where I swear they had an acronym for every phrase under the sun. So your first like 5 meetings, you're like, I have no idea what just happened.
You're like FML.
Pretty much.
The only caveat I would give to what you said is in sort of domain-driven design, if you're kind of following it by the book, is you tend to scope these this common language, which we call ubiquitous languages, if we're using the terms from the books. We scope that to a domain and a team. So you mentioned organization. Like one sort of anti-pattern or thing that can often go wrong is you try and make customer mean the same thing to every team in your organization, and that's often a mistake. Like outside of your domain and your sort of little sort of problem space, your sub-problem space of the entire organization, it's totally okay if a customer means something different to you to what it means to a different team. And then we have sort of a framework for translating between those two things, which in domain-driven design we call published language, which is effectively you can think of as documentation. It's not specific about the documentation or the approach, but an open API spec would be a great example of published language. Like when we say customer, this is what we mean, and this is what we expect you to pass into our system, and this is what you're going to get back, for example.
So with domain-driven design, if like I was working at a company where we wanted to consider it, is this something where is it possible without getting buy-in from everybody, including non-developer teams, or is this something where you kind of have to get everybody to buy into this idea of, you know, having these scoped language or having the scoped language?
Yeah, and I think that's where the power comes into it. And a lot of the emails I get since writing the book is basically that, like, how do I get everyone to adopt this? Like, I've tried to do it on this one thing, and people aren't really buying into it. And I think that's the power of it. If you can get your team on board with it, like that's it. You are in a good place to get started with this. So say me and Matt were working on a project together, the first step would be, hey, Matt, can we agree that every time we use a word and the other one doesn't know what it means, we just write a definition of it? Like you go to the wiki and whatever you use and we agree what a common definition for that is, because that confused both of us. We've now started down the path to domain-driven design and like really moving our organization to a place where we have a common ubiquitous language that we can talk about. And it's something you have to iterate on. You're not going to get all the language and things captured first time. As we kind of navigate and build more things, we're going to learn things, we're going to change definitions, we're going to add definitions. So it's a commitment, but you can get started pretty easily. I would also hazard a guess that some of the patterns, especially the more programmatic patterns that are encouraged in domain-driven design, I would imagine a lot of people are already doing some of them. A lot of this comes from the object-oriented programming world. Adapting it to Go was actually a little bit challenging in some ways because it's not, as you know, John, I've read some of your articles on the same topic. It's not a one-for-one mapping of you do this in an OOP world and it works exactly in Go. So you've got to kind of think a little bit differently about some of them. But things like, I'm a big fan of things like the adapter pattern. So, you know, if you're gonna use a third-party piece of software or a library, and it returns some third-party model, instead of using that model in your code, you translate it into a model that you own, which makes you kind of decoupled from that third-party library. And it means that if you want to move away from it in the future, it's a little bit easier, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I imagine a lot of Go engineers are doing this already, and that's actually one of the things that's talked about quite a bit in domain-driven design is how to do that. So you might find a lot of people are already on their journey without realizing it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the questions that we had was for people who are like scared to go all in on domain-driven design, or like they can't for some reason, like how do they get started? And it sounds like basically just agreeing on some small things like write some definitions down and just use little parts of it is a great step moving forward there. So that's awesome to know because it's really hard at times to get people to buy into like completely shifting how they write code and everything there, but little wins can gradually lead to that success. Yeah,
and it's also totally okay for you to read. There's a couple of really famous books about domain-driven design. Mine's not one of them yet. Hopefully one day it will be. But there's the Big Blue Book and the Big Red Book. The Big Blue Book is pretty hard to read, honestly. But I think the Big Red Book, which I think was written by someone called Vaughan Vernon, is really readable in my opinion. And I think it's worth every engineer reading, even if the takeaway from it is, I don't think this is worth the time investment, or I don't think this is necessarily right for us. I think there's some really great conversations about why you should consider this, and also why, you know, how to structure your software in certain ways that might be really helpful for you to getting started. One of the biggest challenges I find with new Go engineers that domain-driven design personally helped me to kind of really think about was package structure. Like organizing a Go project is really, really hard, especially because it doesn't actually give you too many rules. It's one of the few things that Go isn't very opinionated about. And so having sort of a framework or a pattern to think about how it should look, I find really, really helpful personally. And most of my projects start in this sort of pseudo domain-driven design thing that I've sort of come up with over time after working with lots of people, because it's just a really sensible place to start. And if you do it right, you start to avoid the cyclical dependencies. I remember when I first started with Go, that was always the scariest error to get, is like this package imports this package, which imports this package. And I was like, I don't know how to fix this now. Like, I'm not sure where to go from here. So I think this can help with that.
Yeah, I should just say the Big Blue Book, Domain Driven Design, is by Eric Evans.
Thank you. Yeah, I should have said that. He's the one who started all of this, so definitely worth considering.
I was going to say that like that cyclical pattern you're talking about, I feel like that's even made worse by the fact that some languages allow it. So depending on what patterns you're learning and coming to go from, that could make it even more challenging because you can't just use those patterns.
Yeah. An awful lot of people I've worked with in the past, including myself, truthfully, seem to land on Go from the Java world. And so I think we all go through this transition where we try and apply everything we knew in Java to Go. And it takes a while to break some of those habits. And some of them aren't worth breaking. Some of them, when you challenge people on it, it's like, well, why did you do that? And it's like, well, that's what it worked in Java. And sometimes making a compelling case for why not to do it in Go, other than it's not idiomatic, is challenging. And so I'm still not sure where I land on that conversation, to be honest. Like I really like having sort of things to be standardized. It makes it very easy to transition between projects. But I also struggle when I can't give a concrete reason of like why you shouldn't do that. It's kind of hard sometimes beyond giving that it's not idiomatic response that you see so often in the Go community.
Yeah, I do think we have to watch out for that for sure. But it's interesting because in a way, I think from the beginning of Go, I felt like domain thinking, like domain driven thinking, was kind of advocated for from the beginning. So in a way, I feel like at least this idea that you group things up by responsibility, you have, and I do this, like if I'm modeling like a greeter thing, which is a classic example now, I may, in smaller projects, I may have all those things together, like the actual model of like the inputs, outputs, messages, like having those things near each other really helps, because if you're doing something to do with their greeting, you know where to go for it.
Yeah, 100%. And, to be honest, a lot of people who've looked, if you Google like Go package structure, which is a pretty common thing to do as a new Go developer, you're probably going to get given a project that kind of is encouraging you to organize things in a DDD sort of pseudo fashion. And I think I've seen some of your projects before, Matt. I've seen that grouping. And the same for you, John. Like whether I think, John, I know I've read some of your blogs, so I know you've consciously started to trend that way. But whether you always meant to, or you just kind of landed there after lots of experimentation, I'm not sure. But it kind of just speaks to the fact that DDD sounds scary and it gives a bunch of formal language to a lot of things. But ultimately, I think a lot of people would land on some of these constructs themselves with experimentation anyway.
You had mentioned that some people read the DDD stuff and they'll decide, hey, this is too much work, it isn't for me. So I'll definitely say that on my end, there are some projects where I know going into them that this is not going to be a project that requires a lot of active maintenance or anything. And on those, I will sometimes just throw things together and like tightly couple everything and just not really worry about it. Like I might have like a GitHub user or something from their package just tightly embedded into my code, because it just doesn't matter for what that is. But you are right that like as projects grow, I've noticed that a lot of them tend to trend towards that domain-driven design. And like, I doubt that I do it perfectly, given that it's kind of been something I've learned as I've just gone through designing stuff. So that's one of those reasons why like I've always been weird about sort of sharing my thoughts on it, because I'm like, I don't know if this is true domain-driven design, like, or if I'm like doing something wrong and somebody's gonna get upset about it. But it's like, here are some patterns that have helped me organize code and decouple things, and it works a lot better at that point. But it's also hard because you were talking about like having a team working on stuff, and sometimes when you're working on either a very small team with one or two people or by yourself, you don't really get that feedback. So that can be another challenging part.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, there's actually a really interesting part it's in the Big Red Book, and I included it in my book too. There's actually something called a domain-driven design scorecard, which may be really helpful to help you think about this stuff. And it kind of gives you a rubric and some thoughts about how you can think about a project you're working on to see if it makes sense to actually apply DDD to that project. And some people may be surprised to know that the DDD book, the original one, will discourage you from picking DDD for certain projects, because it understands that there is an overhead of doing a process like this, and it's not always necessary if you're hacking on a side project, or if you're building something that only you are ever going to maintain, or you know exactly the purpose of it. I think it's totally okay to do the things you talked about. And I think the key bit is that you do it consciously, right? If you consciously say, I'm going to couple myself to this package, I know the consequences of that, I'm okay with it. That's slightly different to oh no, I've ended up in this dependency hell, and they updated it, and it's a breaking version, and now I can't run my software, and I didn't know this could happen. I think that's the slight difference. But for projects that have the really simple example I can see here is if your application has less than 40 user stories / business flows, they actually don't really recommend considering DDD for your application. So a lot of solo workers and small apps, like it may be overkill for you.
Yeah, it's interesting as well to consider like how you can evolve your structures and things. If you start, like I think it's quite a safe place to start with DDD because it maps so nicely onto the reality. Because it's too easy if you start like just thinking about breaking packages out and just, it's very easy to just make a mess that way, even though you feel like you're really doing it properly. And so I think one of the other principles that I think are quite important is being able to evolve things and change things as you learn, because you always do. There's always new stuff that you learn as you go.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thought. And I think that fits perfectly into if we model our system after our problem space well, we should be able to do that evolution, and not just from a code standpoint, but from a business standpoint too. So say one of the examples I use in the book is if you go to a coffee shop and you purchase a coffee and you get a stamp, you get a virtual stamp, which is if you get 10 of them, you get a free coffee, or you can use that to pay for a coffee. Like, let's imagine that the rules change so that they want to do a special offer that you only have to buy 5 coffees to get a free drink if they buy certain drinks or from certain locations. Like, these are all natural evolutions of our system that we are 100% gonna go through as a business over time. And so if you've modeled your system in a way that all these things are quite decoupled, and the idea of offers and orders are quite decoupled, and you can evolve these things separately and quickly, it's really powerful. And then when someone from the product management team or the business folks come over and say, what's our current logic for how we distribute loyalty stamps, instead of having to kind of go and find some archaic documentation or try and read some like really difficult code, you can be like, oh, well, on this line, a user makes a purchase, and then if the purchase is successful, then we give them a stamp. Like, you don't even need to convert that into common language, if you will, non-technical language, because it already makes sense because you've modeled your system well.
So how would you identify, if you opened a Go package or you went to an open source Go package, what would you see that made you think this is domain driven? And similarly, what kind of things do you notice when they're not? Or can you not tell?
I mean, truthfully, I haven't really spent too much time kind of digging into that. One thing I do always pay attention to whenever I jump into a project is I always look at the package structure and just see if it makes sense. And a lot of the times the way it does make sense to me is if it's kind of split into like domains, if you will. So the Kubernetes project's a really good one for this. Like, I always use it as a reference just because it's such a massive Go project. But if you head inside the internal folder there, I think you'll see probably hundreds at this point of different resource types. And if you click into those, you can see all these actions that you can take on these resource types. To me, that's a really sensible way to structure such a large project. As someone who's not massively familiar with Kubernetes, and maybe I'm looking for something specific, or maybe I'm just trying to understand how it works, like, to me, that makes it very, very easy to kind of reason about and jump into. If I was really sort of trying to grade them for domain-driven design, I guess I would start looking at like that decoupling between sort of libraries and like their own domain models would be something that I'd particularly look to, because I think for me they're like the really key pieces that make it really, really hard to iterate on a project and to kind of reason about how well maintained I'll find it to get stuck into if those things aren't kind of done well. One thing I've never really seen, to be honest, especially in the open source world, is like an idea of like a ubiquitous language, right? Like when we say these words, this is what we mean. I think that would be useful for some projects, honestly, but I've never really seen that in a repo, I don't think.
Yeah, I think that is a good idea. I quite liked your idea earlier of having that as a rule that you say, if anyone doesn't ever know what we mean when we say a thing, call it out, like make this normal practice. It's very common, especially when new people join a team. They feel like, oh, everyone already knows this. I'm an idiot for not knowing it, which of course is not true. And yeah, like if you do have that glossary as well that's built up, that makes that easier, sure. But yeah, and probably you could start doing that anytime, right? Like you could just start today and say, okay, from now on, anytime we say a term that means something specific to us, we'll get that written up, have a nice definition, maybe a couple of examples. I like that idea.
I feel like it's also a good way to get somebody new contributing like immediately.
Yeah.
Like just that sense of like, hey, I didn't know what that word meant. Can you tell me? And I'll go add it to the glossary.
Oh, you mean other people contributing
Like
that.
if somebody new to the project, like you're saying, doesn't know what a word means, which is completely natural, if they just say, I don't know what that means, but I will add it if you tell me what it means. So like now they have to explain it to them, but then it gets added and that person actually feels like they're making an impact to the project instantly versus like I need to take weeks to get up to speed or something.
Yeah, nice quick win, isn't it?
100%.
Hello, friends. This is Jared here to tell you about Changelog++. Over the years, many of our most diehard listeners have asked us for ways they can support our work here at Changelog. We didn't have an answer for them for a long time, but finally, we created Changelog++, a membership you can join to directly support our work. As a thank you, we save you some time with an ad-free feed, sprinkle in bonuses like extended episodes, and give you first access to the new stuff we dream up. Learn all about it at changelog.com/++. You'll also find the link in your chapter data and show notes. Once again, that's changelog.com/++. Check it out. We'd love to have you with us.
So when we talk about using domain-driven design, I feel like other things like distributed systems and gRPC and a bunch of other stuff comes up. So how does that stuff sort of relate to each other?
And on that point, is this really only useful when you're building microservices? So you have like a microservice that is solving and dealing with a particular piece, and then you have a separate microservice. Does this make sense across the board?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one I get asked a fair amount, to be honest. I think in the book I did two examples. I built a very small monolithic application using domain-driven design, and then I built a microservice. Truthfully, I think microservices are easier, especially from that, like, where do I start perspective, because you only need buy-in from whoever's working on your microservice, right? The monolithic approach is a little bit harder because I think you probably need wider buy-in, especially if you have like lots of lint rules and things set up to enforce certain standards on how your repository might look. It does take a more holistic change. But I do think, depending on how you structure it, for example, say you have code owners of specific folders and domains within your monolithic application, you might already be trending in the right direction anyway. And it might be more you're looking for guidance from the patterns, for example, like how, the adapter pattern we talked about before, or this like idea of open host protocol, which is like we only expose a subset of our system and we make it very clear what you can do. And having things like rules around how you discover, even naming convention. This was very common in the Java world. You would call things like repository layers, like Spring really popularized having like a repo layer, right? And services, and it generates all this stuff for you. So having sort of ruling around what you name things can make it very easy to jump between the projects. So it definitely can work in a monolith as well as it can work in microservices. On the sort of distributed system standpoint, I do find people talking about them together, which I think is, I hope it doesn't do it too much, but I think it does maybe scare people a bit about sort of raising the barrier to entry. I think one really interesting thing that happens as you scale a company, whether you mean to or not, is you start to split teams into domain-based teams. And whether you get that right or not can be reflected in your code. And so, most of the companies I've worked at, we've been split into like, the payment team and a platform team and the, firewall team at Cloudflare, for example. Like we've all got this very small slice of the world that we own. So you're kind of naturally in domains anyway. So it kind of makes sense to start thinking about patterns you can use to make it easy to communicate some of these changes that happen in your world to other teams that might be interested. And I think that's where kind of taking some of these domain-driven design concepts and applying them to distributed system thinking can be really, really valuable. So, one trade-off you have to make pretty early if you want to adopt some distributed systems paradigms is like the concept of eventual consistency, which is something domain-driven design truthfully tries to avoid. Like if you follow domain-driven design from a purist spec standpoint, it tries to get you to group things that are related into things called aggregates. And those aggregates are intended to maintain some sort of transactional guarantee. So an example, again, might be something like an order. If I make an order and I need to take a payment for that order to be successful, and then I also need to dispatch like a physical item, right? Those three things are all connected. So maybe I'll wrap them in an aggregate and I'll treat them as a single thing for the purpose of my code. However, the problem is when you move to distributed systems, you may have an ordering team. You may have a transactions team, for example. You might have a fulfillment team. All these people need to hear about your order. They may need to have a view on it. And you've got to kind of start making decisions about when is it okay for transactions to almost be eventual? Like, when can we have eventual consistency within the system, and when can we not? And so thinking about when that's acceptable and when it isn't is a really great conversation to have up front. And if you started to model your world in terms of aggregates, you would have discovered that quite quickly, that actually we probably shouldn't dispatch something until the payment's been taken for it. So from a thinking perspective, it's very, very helpful. And then there are some other patterns that are kind of really popularized in the DDD space that aren't necessarily domain driven. But one thing I'm a big advocate for that often gets linked to this is like the event driven architecture route, which I think is a really powerful paradigm. So an example of this would be, say a user onboards to the system. We would announce an event to say a user just onboarded after it's happened. So after the event has been completed, and then all the different things within various other subsystems that care about a user being onboarded can then listen. They can take their own action, and they can, eventually consistently we'll update the state of our system to understand that a user joined, and maybe we've created them a card or an account or a website or whatever it might be that it needs for them to happen now that they are onboarded. And that can be so powerful because it means that you've now allowed teams to like ship separately. Like, we're no longer coupled in terms of, well, I can't work on my feature until that happens because I don't care about any of that stuff. All I need to do is know that eventually a user onboarded message is going to show up here, and I need to take an action off the back of that. So that's kind of a really powerful style of thinking, I think, that evolves from this world.
Yeah, and again, you can do that within a monolith. Like that as a design, as a choice, you get to make that anyway. And it often will, like, you are essentially decoupling, like you say, like we're decoupling these things so that they're separated by some other layer, and that allows us to have more flexibility and do more things.
Yeah, and there's a really, really common thing. If you start reading around domain-driven design, you're going to eventually come across CQRS, which is like a really popular pattern that people like to use in this space. So CQRS stands for Command Query Response Segregation. And it's the idea that you can actually divide your system into two parts. You can have this path for querying and this path for updating, effectively, for like updating the system. And the way this approach suggests is that you can, if you issue a command, as they call it, it should either answer a question or like update the state of the system, but not both at the same time. And this is a really sort of powerful way of thinking about kind of modeling some of these, what nowadays would be considered distributed system tasks, but in a more monolithic application world. So I think it was Laravel. Laravel really leans on this concept of commands and issuing commands. So it's actually built directly into the Laravel framework, and it's really, really powerful. It's it's really well thought out, and it makes it very, very easy to use that. And it basically just got, in memory, it's just got an event bus, and it's doing exactly the same as Kafka or RabbitMQ or whatever might be doing under the hood, but it's just shipping messages back and forth between things that are interested in the code. And again, that's in a monolithic application. You can do these things, and it's super interesting.
Yeah, but do you pay a price then? Like, there's more going on, and so there's kind of going to be a cost to that, right? So this is back to really like for small projects, or for, in some cases you might not bother. But how big is that toil? What is the overhead? What sort of things are there?
I think you're right. Like, there's definitely overhead here, and there's toil. And I think to me, it doesn't really make sense if we're talking about distributed systems again and that sort of world. I don't think it makes sense until you've got, 20, 30 engineers to maybe even consider this. I think some companies start as microservices and can be really successful there. I think you have to really know what you're doing to do that. But for a lot of companies, you are probably, better off starting with like a monolith and kind of just focusing on delivering value. Like, a lot of this stuff is shape and structure to how you can make changes safely and deliver value as you scale. If you're comfortable and at the moment your goal is to ship, like, I think it'd be great for everyone to read about this and just make sure they kind of in their head have a clear path to get here, maybe when they need to. But I think you're right. There's tons of overhead that comes with this, and it's not really necessary until you hit, like, if you hit a point when your team are stepping on each other's toes and you're waiting for that pull request by that team to be merged, for that one to be merged, and perhaps you're seeing bugs or issues or misunderstandings around requirements, that's probably the time you should go, hang on, this isn't working for us. Maybe we need to think about the way we plan and ship software, and domain-driven design is a really good place to start. If you're iterating fine, you're shipping fine, you're not really seeing many issues, you're doing a great job doing what you need to do, and you're making it, and you've got a really great sort of line of communication with the folks who are making decisions, like, probably overkill at this point, I think.
We talked about distributed systems then. I know you have talked about, in your book, I believe it goes into gRPC and how that relates to domain-driven design. So I guess what's sort of the link there, and why does that end up in the book and get talked about?
Truthfully, I just look for any excuse to talk about gRPC because I love it. I think for internal communication, I think gRPC is probably one of the greatest things that has been invented, if you will. I think from a DDD perspective, I've mentioned the idea of having sort of published language, which is, as you know, my team looking out towards the world. Like, this is what our contract looks like. This is what in the same way in a monolith or in sort of any application, you're going to define a contract, right? Like, when you talk to me, this is what it's going to look like. This is the function signature I'm going to satisfy. We can do the same thing to other teams too. And usually we'll define a open API spec, or maybe we'll write in a wiki, just like what everything means, or maybe we'll write a protobuf. And I guess my thoughts on gRPC is protobufs are very, very readable. They kind of give you forwards and backwards compatibility out of the box. And one of the really powerful things about gRPC, especially if you are working in a bigger company or a bigger team, is that it has support for generating code for lots and lots of different languages. So as much as I wish the whole world would just use Go, sometimes for some reason people pick other languages. And so being able to support them and not be opinionated about how they build their systems is really, really powerful. And that's something that starts with a protobuf, which is most of our protobufs in Cloudflare are sort of 10, 15 lines long, right? And they've got very clear headings about what this is, what the type of it is. It gives you that type safety. And from that, I can generate code for so many languages. So that sort of domain-driven design has this concept of, as I mentioned, of like the open host protocol, open host service, basically opening a subset of our system to the world. I think gRPC is a really great way of satisfying that particular piece. And if we're building distributed systems or building anything, truthfully, we're going to have to find a way to share it with people somehow. And this is protobuf and gRPC in general is a really great way to do that, I think.
Have you used gRPC much, John?
I've used it like in toy projects, nothing beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
I liked what I used. It was cool. It just I haven't like run into a case where I'm like, okay, this definitely makes sense. I need to spend more time with it because I think it's one of those technologies that people have been like, hey, will you make a course about this?
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, sometimes the questions confuse me. Like, I had somebody ask me to make a course or show them how to test a gRPC type setup. And I'm like, it has an interface there for you. Like, it's basically just testing like an interface. So I was confused about some of that, depending on how they're doing it. But that's not to say it's a bad question. I think sometimes people just sort of that goes over their head that, hey, when there's an interface, you could mock whatever you want at that point and pretty easily test anything that way. But no, I haven't like used it in a large project.
Well, Matt, do interfaces help? Like, you mentioned that it isn't necessarily a natural fit for Go, but do interfaces play a big part in this?
I think so, especially if you're doing it within the monolith, for sure. Like, I think all the good software engineering practices that you know today are still relevant here. And you'll often see DDD, TDD, and BDD said in the same breath, which again I think is confusing and is another barrier to entry. It's like, what do all those different things mean? Like, which one should I care about first and which one matters? But as you're building out your domain-driven project, like, I still highly recommend following TDD practices and ensuring you've got great test coverage, because it gives you even more safety that you're doing the right thing. And if you if you name your tests well, again, it's just another further way of describing some of the business logic and making sure all the edge cases are covered for you too. So 100% interfaces are invaluable, because otherwise it just makes it really hard to test some of the stuff.
Yeah. Is TDD even easier if you follow domain-driven design?
It's a good question. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I hope so, because I think it will give you, I've spent an awful lot of time talking about package structure, but I think that's one of the biggest values I get out of this. It makes it very easy to structure my applications. And so then it also makes it very easy to reason about tests. Like, all of my actual business logic lives within these files. And so I'm going to make sure they've got great test coverage, and I can test them in isolation. And then maybe I'll have some integration tests above those to test like bigger flows. But from a sort of TDD standpoint, it's like, I'm going to start with this specific entity. I'm going to do some testing around that stuff, and then I'm going to move on to the next bit. And I find that quite powerful in how I think about this stuff, I think.
Mm. Well, one of the questions I get all the time is, what's John Calhoun's problem? But the second most popular question is like about this subject of package structure. How should I lay out my projects? So just as a sort of thought experiment and a bit of an exercise, Matt, like, let's imagine we're going to model an online shop, and this is a Go project, and so we expect this is going to be big. So we want to follow domain-driven design practices. There's going to be lots of teams, lots of people interacting. What folders do you create? Talk us through a little bit of what this repo looks like.
I feel very on the spot. I mean, so truthfully, when I open my IDE, the first thing I always do is I initiate a Go mod project. So if you use Goland, like it does this for you when you create a new repo, you just point it at your GitHub repo you're eventually going to have, and now you've got Go modules. So you're already on the right path. I then make a CMD repo, which is just kind of, isn't really a domain-driven design thing, but I think it really does help, especially if you expect to have more than one binary. So I'd create my CMD folder, and then I'd create whatever my project's going to be called. So I'm going to call this one Coffee Shop. Inside there, I'd make a main.go and then put in a main func. I'd make sure it runs. I'm in a good spot. So step one, we're all good. The next thing I do is always make an internal folder. So I'm actually not sure if this is the latest practice, so please forgive me if this is incorrect, but in the olden days, you used to make an internal folder and a PKG folder. The internal folder, it was meant to be a hint not to import anything from within this project. But if I'm correct, I think Go actually stops you from importing from other projects' internal folders.
Yeah, they enforce that now too.
Awesome.
I think they also enforce it like at a nested layer. So like if you had inside your CMD project as a random example, you stuck in another like internal folder, it would actually stop anything like from above that level from importing stuff. It's something like that.
So that's a thing in Go, yeah. Internal packages, well, it's just a folder called internal, and that essentially means this is for this area only, don't import this elsewhere. And that is very important because essentially you're protecting those things from becoming dependencies unexpectedly, right?
And that's really powerful for domain-driven design because you've basically, I talked about this this idea of a bounded context, and we have our own sort of language that doesn't necessarily need to mean anything to the outside world. Well, Go actually gives you a way to enforce that. So if you have your internal folder and you put all your internal stuff and language and stuff inside there, and then you have the separate concept where people can import your published, what you deem to be your published language, you've kind of decoupled yourself already. So you're already setting yourself up for success by following the model of having that internal package. Like, I think the internal package is fantastic. I actually didn't know that it was enforced, so that's even better news. I thought it was just kind of hinting, and I've always kind of followed those rules for the project. So it's great that I actually can't. So that's awesome. So inside that internal project, you would then make, how I typically do it is I'd have in this instance, for let's use the coffee shop example, I might have loyalty, which to me sounds like a domain. You may have a loyalty team. Inside loyalty, I would probably make another file called loyalty.go. And this is where sort of the main sort of models and some of the services and logic for loyalty would live.
So that matches the package name. So the .go, it matches the package name, and that's how you know this is kind of like the important starting point almost of this package.
Yeah, that's what I do. I've seen other people do different things, and they like to break out their files into the project into lots of little files. I prefer to. There's an old principle I got told a while ago, which I really like, which is to declare things as close to where you're going to use it as possible. And so by doing that, it really means that I have not many files, to be honest. I tend to kind of squish things and tend to move them when they get too unwieldy and they don't make sense. But the fact I can have a loyalty package with loyalty.go and then loyalty_test.go in, I feel like my intentions are very, very clear about what's going on there.
Yeah, and as well, think about the practical usability of that. If you had just everything was called like models.go or handlers.go inside these packages, when you're sort of navigating the files quickly, you have to do a bit more work to figure out, is this in the right folder? And very often, I've done this before in projects that don't quite follow that, where you open the wrong file and it's just really confusing. You really feel like, and it doesn't make sense. And it's just literally that you probably jumped into a different folder. I like mono repos too. So this is kind of like, those usability things become quite important. And I follow the same pattern. It's like that file that matches the package. If it's a main.go, that's different. But that's again, tells you this is the main place. So I think that's quite a nice pattern.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And then I would just follow the same sort of pattern, honestly. This is the thing, once you get into it, there's no real complexity here. Like if I was starting to talk about the payment domain, I'd make a payment folder. I'd have the payment.go. The only difference I might have in something like the payment world is I might make a file called stripe.go. I would do particularly. And then that would be in stripe.go, I would have my concrete, I'd probably define my interfaces for payments in payments.go. And in the Stripe.go, I would satisfy that interface for Stripe specifically. And then that just allows me to have that looser coupling. And you just follow that through for the rest of your project, honestly.
So if you have HTTP handlers, where would you put those?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I've tried a few different approaches to this. I'd be interested to hear what you two think on this, actually. So I've tried like declaring like the handler.go inside the domain. So I would have like, in the example we've used here, I might have payment.go, stripe.go, and then maybe handler.go, which would be my HTTP handler. I then might have another package called transport where I'd kind of gel all these things together and start my router and get things, and then use that main.go to start a HTTP server. I think that makes sense, but sometimes I feel like it makes more sense to group HTTP as a concept and maybe put all the handlers in transport.go, and then all those handlers do are very loose things. All they do is they receive the request, they validate that maybe specific headers and things are on it, and then I just call down to a service layer. So the HTTP layer becomes really, really light, and I don't really see the value of putting a handler in every folder. So I'd love to hear what you two think and where you've landed on that one.
I don't feel like I've actually landed on like one being the perfect solution is the best way I'd put it. Because I've tried all sorts of, like the most obscure one I tried was I literally tried to make every handler like its own like package essentially. And inside of that, I was defining like what it's expecting to receive as part of the request and like what it's planning to respond. And then I had to sort of decouple everything so that whenever you were setting stuff up, you had to make sure that that all translated correctly with like an adapter layer. And that was way too tedious. Like it was like kind of cool at first, like the sort of like uniqueness of it. And then after you started like managing the application with it, it was like, this is brutally like way too much. So like I've stopped doing that. I tend to like, I like to have my handlers kind of chunked up based on what they're related to. So I think I would tend to do something along the lines of like in loyalty, I might have a handler.go with all the loyalty related handlers inside of, you know, like payments, there'd be another set of payment handlers. But it's also hard sometimes where like you'll be setting up your application and like it really needs like 3 different sets of handlers to even function correctly. So it feels a little bit weird there where you're like, well, I need all 3 of these anyway. Like, why are they separated? Like they're not as linked as they are.
Yeah, and I think you're right. If you're using like code generation, which I do quite a lot, use code generation, which generates a lot of the boilerplate bits. Then that literally goes into one file because it's almost, it's code gen. It's not something I'm ever going to really touch. And then I use interfaces for services to sort of like, then that's where the real thing happens. But this is, I think interesting to consider that. But I think in your world, if there was anything specific in the handling, I would probably expect to go to like the loyalty folder, and that's where I would want everything basically to do with loyalty stuff. So, but it probably depends on, like you say, what they're doing. If they're just simple boilerplate things and they're all the same, then, interesting. And what about databases? What about like, so you'll have like, say you'll have the loyalty thing that's the public type that people see and interact with, but then you may also have your own internal database type. What do you do with those?
Yeah, that's another one where I've gone back and forth a little bit on it personally. I think typically what I do now is I actually make a folder called store, and I'll have repository.go and store.go. So inside store.go, I'll typically do like a lot of the boring stuff in regards to the database, like actually getting myself connected and set up and maybe providing some small abstractions there. And then in the repository, again, I've gone back and forth. I may have like a store loyalty.go, and inside that I'll have all the loyalty repository related activities, so writing and reading from the database. I've also tried putting that in the loyalty folder itself. I think I like it better in a separate package for the exact reason that you kind of hinted at then, is that it's very easy to get confused between internal types and like database types. And one of the biggest anti-patterns I've seen, just not even in domain-driven design, although it's a big part of it, but just in software in general, is intrinsically linking your business logic to your database. And that can create real challenges, especially if you let the database tail wag the dog, as it were. If you let a bunch of your logic or the design of your application start to be shaped by the database that you've chosen, you're going to have some real challenges in the future as you try and upgrade databases or maybe migrate from Postgres to Mongo. These things happen fairly irregularly to most people, so perhaps it's not something worth worrying about. But as you start to work in bigger companies, like these things do happen occasionally, especially the database upgrades where you need to get new features or deprecate this, that, and the other. And so having that separation of concerns is really valuable. So to literally put them in different folders, one where you're going store, the package is called store, and you're going store.loyalty and you get a model, hopefully gives you some hint that you probably shouldn't be using that in your application layer, and it probably should be pushed down a little bit. So I think that's where I've landed for now. But one thing I hope that people take away from this conversation, if nothing else, is we all write a lot of Go, and we're still not sure on how to do these things. We're still experimenting and moving things around, and you should totally not be afraid to do that. Even if you've got like lots of senior people in your team telling you not to do X, Y, Z, like experiment, because you might find something new that works really well for you.
Yeah. I love the idea of having the package name right there in the code so that you can see what the type is. Do you end up having lots of translation types where you're just basically changing one struct to another?
Yeah, and if you're being a purist, I definitely do. But this is what I mean. Like, one thing I hope people do take away from my book is like pragmatism. Like, you can implement these bits in pieces and in chunks, and you can choose to skip the ones that slow you down that you may not think are valuable. But as long as you can have like a good conversation about why that trade-off is okay, that's totally fine. And I've definitely seen in some of our service layers, like going directly from sort of the repo layer to going from the database layer, directly to like the application model without using a repository. And if you're being a purist, you would say never do that. But if you're trying to move quick and you know the trade-offs and you know the tech debt you're accruing, like it's a lever you can pull, and that's completely okay to do as long as you make your Jira ticket and you think about going back to it when it matters, you know.
I'll definitely say that's something I've done a lot myself. Is like, I know I shouldn't be basing my stuff off the database models because I've seen how it leads to like poor API design and all sorts of other stuff where you're not really giving the end users the data they want. You're just giving them the data that's easy to fetch at that point based on the database model you have. And I'll start that way, but I usually do it, like you said, with the mindset of, I know at some point if this gets big enough and evolves enough, this needs to change. But I think this is a way quicker way to get started, to just have that, like database ID or something just hard coded in there.
Yeah, there is something that it gives you an acceleration if your API essentially matches a lot your database. But that is then coupling it. So that is then a firm thing that you are. And if and when it's time to break that, you then have to be prepared to pay the debt to do that. But the thing is, you may never need to. So it's like, interesting about like when you start applying these things and what you can really get away with. Like kicking things down the road, I think like kicking the can down the road is often talked about as a fail of a team or something, but can genuinely sometimes really be the right thing to do. Maybe it's time for the unpopular opinions, but like sometimes if you can defer a decision and not paint yourself into a corner, you can move a lot more quickly. But I think it relies on, you have to be honest and admit that I'm getting this advantage now and may well have to pay that back later.
I think people ignore the fact that like projects cost money and you need to like prove that it's actually worth the money that's being spent, which means at some point you can't just be like, I'm going to make everything perfect code and be so pragmatic. You have to be more pragmatic, I guess. And just say, we're going to focus on the important stuff and we'll fix those things later when the project is earning money and it's actually like able to pay for this. I feel like that's one of the reasons why like some people would benefit from working at a startup or something small where like they don't have a corporate budget and they actually have to find a way to make money, versus like at a corporate gig, usually it's like, here's the big project, you've got 2 years to build it. So it's not like you're sitting there thinking, oh, I have to prove that this works in the next 6 months. It's more like we have plenty of time to sit down and design everything, get it right. And it makes sense there because Google can't release some, half-baked product that's completely terrible to their millions of users. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, there's something nice as well about how some of the pain that you start to feel is really a really good indicator that there's something needs to be done. Matt, you mentioned this earlier. Like if it's working and it's painless and it's kind of easy, then great. Maybe you've got it right. But as you start to then hit that pain points, and I think test-driven development, I mean, I personally only do like test-driven development now. Why is it hard to test? Could it be made easier to test? Could you change things to make it easier? I've also heard the counter argument of where people say, well, just because you're writing tests first, it shouldn't change the design of your system. In my experience, it should and does, and it's better when it does. That's just in every case I've ever seen. But this is the interesting thing. I think there is very little that's right and wrong in software, right? There's loads of ways to be successful. But this Yeah, I mean, Matt, I really, I'm going to get your book. Give it a read. It's domain-driven.
You also have to give it a review.
Oh, yeah, okay.
You know how hard it is to write a book. You got to help review these books. And anybody who's listening, if you happen to grab Matt's book, definitely leave a review. That helps so much with when you're authoring a new book.
Yeah, unless you hate it, in which case don't worry about it.
Well, don't leave that to
yourself.
Yeah, let me know on Twitter if you hate it instead.
Yeah. This is domain-driven design with Golang. For those that want to find it, we'll put the link in the show notes as well, and you can get it as an ebook. And they've also tried this innovative thing where they print it out, Matt, is that right? And put it on.
Yeah, they will send you like a physical copy, which is rare in this day and age. But if you want to, you can purchase one. Rather interestingly, most people are buying physical books over ebooks for technical books. I'm not sure if that's a technical specific niche, but yeah, I was quite surprised to see the uptick on the physical version is much higher than the ebook.
Yeah. I get that because we're on screens all the time. It's really nice to be able to go somewhere else and have a book, frankly. So I'm all in on. In fact, I struggle with like Kindles and other e-readers, honestly.
It's also really satisfying to just be able to like mark up a book with like, oh, this is a cool idea, I want to try it. And it's harder to do that on other stuff. It just doesn't feel as natural.
Yeah. But if you're trying to look up what a word means and you don't have the glossary handy, and you press and hold a book, you can really embarrass yourself in Starbucks, and you have to go home because you feel embarrassed.
You also have to like code everything, like letter for letter, and hope you get it all right. But maybe that's a good thing.
That reminds me of how I learned, was copying basic code out of magazines and making little games that way. So I'm very happy doing that. And actually, I don't know, I find that gives me some advantages in some ways, weirdly. It's like one of those, I see people that just use keyboards and they don't use the mouse, and they're amazingly fast and stuff because they're from the olden days.
In university, I always remember in second year we had this programming exam, and you weren't allowed to use a computer, so it was all on paper, and you had to write this Java program to do something. I don't remember exactly what it was.
Java as well.
Yeah, Java. And I always remember that I got marked down because I incorrectly imported a package. Like, I hadn't imported the correct package. And I thought that was so mean. I was like, as if you're marking me down on paper for not importing a package correctly. It's always stuck with me.
Yeah, I bet you've never made that mistake again.
No, all my packages are imported correctly all the time now.
There you go. Put that on your CV.
Can import a package.
10 years importing packages.
Gets it right first time, every time. That's your advert. That could be on your book. Is that on the back of your book? It's like all the packages have been properly imported.
I can't even guarantee that's true. I hope it's true, but
He's like, we wanted to make sure we fixed the bugs before the second version, and we'll put it on the second version.
yeah,
Got to give them a reason to get the second edition, I suppose.
exactly.
Now with improved imports.
It is now time to talk about unpopular opinions.
I actually think you should probably leave.
So, Matt, we'll start with you. Do you have an unpopular opinion you'd like to share?
I do. So I actually was trying to think deeply about a technical one, because I know most people share technical ones, but most of mine have been covered, honestly, on other shows. I really enjoyed the one, I think it was last week's. It was like, the right tool for the job is not the right tool for the job. Like, I really identify with that one. So I've gone for one which I think is incredibly controversial, because I can't find anybody who agrees with me on this. But I think you should be able to take your laptop to the movies or the cinema with you if you're in the UK, and you should be able to sit there and like program and type while you're in the movies.
What?
Yeah, that's kind of the reaction I get.
What's the thinking there, mate? What's going on? Are you not interested in the film?
No, not at all.
How often does this happen?
So I think I've seen probably thousands of movies, but I couldn't tell you what happens in any of them, because I usually sit and watch TV with my partner. Like, she's watching something and I'm just like working on a project or writing a book, apparently, doing stuff like that. I love having the background noise, and I love having something to look up at. I was like, oh, that's interesting, but I'm not necessarily that engaged with the film. And truthfully, I struggle to sit there for like 3 hours watching something, especially if it's not very good. However, it doesn't mean that I don't want to see parts of the latest and greatest films. I think it'd be very nice to sit and watch the latest and greatest and see snippets of whatever The Rock is up to this week whilst programming away on my side project. And I feel like there's a market for this. I feel like there are other software engineers and other people who quite happily sit, not necessarily making a bunch of noise, but just have that sort of backlight on their laptop where they could kind of sit and work on something while they're watching the latest and greatest film.
Right. So like an ADHD screening or something. Like because they have those ones where you can take your babies, screaming babies.
Well, I feel like we're trending this direction anyway. There's all these cinemas now where you can take food in now. Like you can get like a full meal served to you at some other cinemas. So I feel like we're only one stretch away from being able to have a full business meeting in the middle of a movie. So
Yeah, but we've got to draw the line somewhere. What next? Toilets. Each seat's just a toilet as well. For those that really love the film. Do you know what I mean?
Those are the people who pay for like 4 films back to back.
Well, to be fair, yeah, they do need that.
See, the toilets might also help them make money because then you're going to buy more soda and more all the other stuff that's there. Whereas Matt's going to be going in there not buying popcorn or anything because you can't eat popcorn and type on a computer. That just doesn't work. At least I don't know how you do it without greasing up your keyboard so bad.
Well, Johnny Borsico's got a tip for you. This was on a previous episode, John, and proves you don't listen to the podcast episodes that you're not on.
I listened to some.
He uses chopsticks to eat Cheetos.
Chopsticks?
Yeah, for Cheetos. So he doesn't grease his fingers up for his typing. I actually think that's brilliant.
Have you ever seen there's like little things you can get between your 2 fingers. This is terrible for a podcast.
It's not.
There's it's like almost chopsticks that just attach to like near the knuckles of your like 2 fingers so that you can still type, but then you can just like reach up and squeeze your 2 knuckles to grab it and eat stuff.
Can't even imagine that.
I swear, I don't know where I've seen it, but I saw it somewhere. I'll have to find
it
it.
does sound like you're describing scissors, I think.
It's not scissors. I know what scissors are. I have a 4-year-old daughter who loves arts and crafts.
That's nice. But would she do that whilst in the cinema, or would she sit like a good girl and watch the film?
If we gave her the option, she'd probably do arts and crafts during the cinema.
See, there's a market for this, Matt, you see?
Yeah. Well, so hang on then, Matt. Have you sort of like just passively watched all the major films, but you don't really know what they are?
Exactly. I could tell you like various, if I just happened to have looked up at the right time, I could probably tell you somewhat what happened in some of these films, but honestly, like last time I watched the film all the way through. Let's
do a new section then. Glance reviews by Matt Boyle. Right. Describe the Terminator movie.
I don't think I can do it without swear words because I just remember, the key bits where he says, "Give me your clothes." That makes you look up and you're like, "Oh wow, this is like a good bit." So I'll watch the action film. I have to say, if you're going to glance watch a film, like the Marvel films are fantastic. Every time you look up, something cool's happening. It doesn't have any context. You don't know why it's happening, but it is awesome to watch.
That's true. You don't need the context even, right? It's like, oh, well, these 2 superheroes are fighting. Cool.
Exactly. And it's a great way to spend 5 seconds while you're waiting for your code to compile,
Yeah. I suppose as you went from Java to Go, did you find that you knew less and less about the films?
Yeah, things just got too fast. I'm thinking of going backwards, actually, and maybe I'll start writing some PHP again, and then, I'll get that slow down in my development stream, and I'll have more time to watch movies.
I feel like this really just means that your partner wants you to go to more movies and you just want to code more.
Yeah.
So you're looking for like some place that'll let you do both.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's fair.
But I don't get away with that because she says to me, well, I want to have a shared experience. You can't just be sat there tapping away.
So say my wife's terminology is, I want quality time. This is not quality time. And I'm like, yeah, that's fair.
I definitely get laptop, like, you have to watch this. Like this is a laptop closed sort of evening. Like, I do definitely get in trouble sometimes, but I do get away with it more than it sounds like you folks do. So maybe I'm just lucky.
Yeah, this is like, right, laptop closed because Arnold Schwarzenegger's about to say he's going to be back, and you can't miss this. It's a classic.
Otherwise, you won't know what happens in the 2 films when he shows up.
When he comes back. Yeah. You're like, hang on, why is he back? Well, if you'd paid attention in the first film, that's a really interesting one. That, I guarantee, will be, I think, our most unpopular opinion.
There's no way it's popular.
But mind you, hang on. So the other thing is, so this is where I'm kind of with you. Like, if I'm watching if there's tech in a kind of movie, and it's futuristic tech stuff or hacking, and honestly, it can be like 3D. You won't know this reference, Matt, but there's like often 3D cubes need to be completed, and then that you've hacked into the system and things like this. I sometimes do get quite inspired by stuff like that, and I'm like, oh, that really makes me want to do something. And I'm like, well, I'll have
to get a Rubik's Cube.
I'll have like ideas. Do you do a Rubik's Cube with your laptop there, and you sort of just glance up at it every now and then and see how well you're doing?
No, absolutely not. I must admit, I haven't taken inspiration from films, so maybe I should watch them. It sounds like you've been pretty successful with some of your side projects, Matt. Maybe I should pay more attention, and maybe mine will be more successful.
It depends what film, I suppose. Like, don't take any inspiration from the Terminator, please, especially as AI is now getting really good, and don't pop it in a strong metal body. Is my advice.
You don't want them to watch that and be like, I could do that.
Yeah.
The technology's there.
Yeah. I saw someone the other day and they said to me, maybe I'll be back, like a sort of tentative Terminator, which I thought was really strange. But yeah, it's funny. Do you miss a lot of references and stuff, Matt, do you think? Because you sort of...
I don't think so, because I spend way too much time on Reddit. So I think a lot of the key references that people are going to use, I'm usually like quite ahead of the curve, honestly, because it's probably hilarious. I'm probably not watching the film to read about it on Reddit or to watch the subset of the memes that have come up from it, and so I learned that way. So between my glancing and the memes, I've probably caught most of the story if it's important. But I mean, maybe it's just me, but I feel like films are way less interesting generally these days at the cinema anyway. It seems to be a lot of rehashes and big blockbuster action films where I say like the story isn't great, so I just don't feel massively inspired to sit and dedicate 3 hours to it. And so I'm quite happy to work on something more interesting and just kind of glance up.
I agree with you on those kinds of sort of big, broad movies like that. But there are some great movies that, like Primer, you should, like that one, you kind of do have to watch it properly. It's a time travel movie, but it's very complicated. Probably you'd like it. It's complicated and hard.
He would somehow watch it while programming and be like, oh, it makes complete sense because I missed all the other
It's
stuff.
like A Beautiful Mind, isn't it? Might just be that you're too clever, Matt.
I don't think that's the case. No.
Okay.
My high school teachers would disagree with you on that one, I think.
Yeah, but they're not. If sometimes if they're not smart enough, they don't notice. They just think he just has his laptop open all the time in class, and when he's trying to do PE.
He's playing dodgeball, just typing away. All right, Matt, with the short T, do you have an unpopular opinion you'd like to share?
I do. The bullet points in Wikipedia are way too close to the text, frankly. I don't know what's going on there. Like, you need a bit more space, I think. It's genuinely, it's the primary reason why I don't donate.
Speechless.
This is like your movies I'm slagging off now, isn't it, Matt?
Yeah. I must admit, I don't know if I've ever noticed. So I don't know if that says more about me or you, but I just I use Wikipedia a lot. To be honest, I get quite frustrated with the big banner that shows up when it's time to donate, and that's more infuriating than the bullet points. I understand why they do it, of course, but yeah, I've never noticed the bullet points. So I imagine now every time I go on Wikipedia, they're going to stand out to me like really clearly, and it's going to annoy me now too. So I appreciate that.
I hope so. Yeah, that's what I hope.
I was going to tell you if you zoomed in that maybe it would give you a bigger gap, but I don't think it actually does.
Not these days. It used to do stuff like that, but no. I don't know. Honestly, like I'm sure they've done usability. There's a lot of information they pack in. Maybe that's it. They're like, people have donated $3 to this a year, so we've got to really make it good for them. So they're like, let's pack the info in because these people. I do donate to Wikipedia, by the way.
I feel like there's no way they did a usability study, because I feel like if they did, then all this text would have like triple space between all the lines. Like, I feel like every time like Gmail does a usability study, all of a sudden they're like, here's the new UI. You can see 4 emails on your whole screen.
Yeah. Well, that's the kind of like design principles. Like, you do want to give things space and stuff, and I understand how that happens, but yeah. I don't know. I
wonder how much you'd have to donate to get them to like specifically move the bullet points for you.
Well, it's Wikipedia. I should be able to edit them myself.
It's for a script to edit every page.
I mean, I'm assuming they're using some sort of shared style sheet.
Yeah, probably. But
if they've got a new style sheet for every single page, then no wonder they need donations for their server bill every day.
Can you edit? Yeah, it's a shame when you click edit, you can't just edit the entire page though, and including the CSS. And submit changes like that. It should be wiki CD CSS as well, I think.
Probably a good reason for that, I think.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I can think of an old social network that is pretty much living proof as to why you can't do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I miss those websites that were terrible. Like when the texture, the background was a repeated image of something, and then you couldn't read any of the text. You have to highlight it to read it. Come on, bring it back.
I love it on Reddit now and again when like a GeoCity site trends and you get to there's all this nostalgia from the past of these GeoCity sites that someone built for their dog or something, and I love them, honestly. I think the internet was a better place back then.
Yeah, it does feel like it, doesn't it? Sometimes.
All right. Well, Matt, thank you for joining. Matt, thank you for helping me host. Everyone else, thank you for joining us. And as Matt said, go check out Matthew's book, Domain-Driven Design with Golang.
We have a fun bonus in store for Changelog++ members. Right after the show, the guys hung out to discuss all kinds of stuff like programming around leap years, Y4K protection, yes, that's a thing, and children swearing.
When you're a parent, you've got different responsibilities. I'm an uncle. I've got a little niece, honestly the most adorable little girl I've ever seen in my life, little 3-year-old. If she were to swear, that would be the greatest day for me. I'd love it.
Sign up for Changelog++ to hear the rest, make the ads disappear from all of our pods, and directly support our work here at Changelog. Special thanks to our friends at Fastly and Fly for partnering with us to bring GoTime to you. Check them out at fastly.com and fly.io. And thank you to the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder for bumping out the beats for us on a regular basis. Last but not least, thank you for listening. Without you, GoTime would be seriously not worth all of our efforts. That is all for now. We'll talk to you again next time on GoTime.